On this super review, let's take a look at the T2 Pro from Tin Hifi. If you've been following my channel lately, you've probably seen a handful, quite a few budget IEMs come through my door. And in fact, not too long ago, I got the T2 from Tin Hifi and I loved him. I gave him 5 stars out of 5. Well, now Tin Hifi has a sequel, and this is the T2 Pro. What makes it pro? Well, we're gonna find out. Let's go ahead and unbox it. I'll give it a listening test. I'll run it against my reference library of music, and I'll let you know, how does the T2 Pro compare to the original T2, and maybe how does it compare to some of the other IEMs that I've listened to lately. All right, let's check it out. All right, so we've got the T2 Pro in a box, and I'll be honest, this box looks just like the T2 box, except that it says Pro here over here in the right corner. Same information on the back, which is to say basically no information. There's nothing for us to learn about this product on the outside, and that's because this is a product for someone who probably already knows what they're getting into, all right? You are getting into a budget in-ear monitor headphone from a company called Tin Hifi, or Tin Audio, kind of depending on where you see it. Just for reference, over here I do have the original T2s, and I'm really interested to see not just how do these compare sound-wise, but physically. I'm interested to see if there's any differences between these and the originals. But yeah, so without further ado, let's go ahead and crack it open. All right, so what do you get in the box of the T2 Pro? Well, it pretty much looks like what you got in the box with the regular T2. No surprise there. So, like the T2, you get a really nice unboxing experience with this box that has like this faux leather wrapping on it that feels way too nice to throw away. I'm gonna have to keep 2 of these in my closet now. Thanks a lot, Tin. You do get a little bit of literature here that I have not even opened, and frankly, I'm going to do my hardest to not ever have to open this. I just don't want to read. You do get a good selection of tips, including basically 2 different styles. It's coming with the foam ear tips that are pre-installed, and then it's got 3 sizes of 2 different styles of ear tip. So the difference between these is in the size of the bore. Some of these have a narrower bore and some of them have a wider bore. And in my experience with other headphones, typically the narrower the bore, the more emphasized the bass and maybe the more reduced the treble, where kind of the opposite with the wider bores. And as we come around to the butt itself, it feels like it's exactly the same. I'm not gonna be able to tell these apart, am I? If you look really closely, there is a slight difference in the tint of the color. So pay no attention to the fact that I have different ear tips on here, but the metal right here on the outside, you can see that this is a lighter silver color than that. Let's see if I can actually put it up against it directly. That's pretty close to the same thing, but maybe slightly different. Maybe I'm also just imagining that. Am I just imagining that? No, I'm not just imagining that. The original T2 has a slightly darker silver color. Wow, that is barely different. I'm for sure gonna have a hard time telling these apart if I get these separated. So the one physical difference that does stand out that's, you know, pretty obvious is just in the style of this connector. In fact, I didn't notice this just pulling out of the box, but this is actually bigger and heavier than this connector, in addition to having sort of a different style of, you know, faux carbon fiber. The rest of the cable, honestly, it feels the same. It's got the same Y connector. The braid feels very similar. It's the same like 8-core braided, which is in fact a more complicated braid than I've seen on some of these other IEMs. Some users, I saw a number of people were having issues with the connectors on their T2s, and frankly, I've had these T2s now for a couple of months. I've been using them a lot, and I've not had any problems with my connectors. That said, like, I'm not disconnecting and reconnecting them constantly. I've just basically left them on. I don't know if there's going to be any difference with this cable versus the new cable. Despite the fact that it does look slightly different, it also feels, frankly, exactly the same. But yeah, that's about as much as I can tell you about the T2 Pro until I give it a listen. So let's pull on the Walkman. Let's hook these up and listen to them, put them against my reference library of music. I got a little De La Soul, a little Michael Jackson, a little Agnes Obel, a bunch of different types of music that I'm gonna go ahead and listen to, and I'm gonna go back and forth with the original T2s and see if I can tell a difference. I don't know how good my ears are, if I'm gonna be able to tell a difference, or maybe it's gonna be an obvious difference, and maybe I'm going to come back and let you know that the T2s are totally better, or totally worse, or totally the same. I don't know, we'll find out. Either way, I just want you to know ahead of time, the T2, the original, I gave these 5 stars out of 5. I stand behind that. These things are awesome. Now let me go ahead and listen to the T2 Pros, where hopefully I still think that. Okay, I've been listening to the Tin Hifi T2 Pros quite a bit now. I've been comparing them with just the original T2s, as well as like some of the KZ and TRN headphones I've been listening to lately. And I've got some thoughts. All right, so just for context, the original T2s are, of all the IEMs I've been listening to lately, they're still my favorites. They're the ones I keep going back to. And it's not because they have the best bass or like the strongest highs. Frankly, what I love about the original T2s is the mids. And I love that it's just kind of like a neutral sounding headphone that complements kind of all music. I really love the original T2s, and this is the T2 Pro, so I've got high expectations for it. Now, there's a lot about the T2 Pro that's very similar to the original, and that much is kind of obvious just looking at it, all right? The basic build of this thing is nearly identical to the original T2s. Comes with the same, I think, really cool looking blue foam tips. Comes with roughly the same set of, silicone tips and roughly the same cable, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So it really is quite a bit like the original T2s. The real difference with the Pro comes with the sound tuning. All right, so back to the originals real quick. What I loved about those is just the neutral sound with the very present mids. I like a V-shaped headphone every once in a while, but what really keeps me coming back is mids. I don't know why, I tend to like mids in my music. So that's what I really liked about the original T2s. One small downside to the neutrality of the T2s is that they can sound a little bit dull. And now for me, like, I'm willing to make that sacrifice for neutral sound, but they can sound a little bit dull. And I found that with the foam tips on the originals, it made them sound even a little bit more dull. So if I put on the silicone tips in the originals, I thought that it kept some of the liveliness that was there and it made them sound the best. So when I started to compare the Pros versus the originals, I set up the Pros just like I had the originals, right? I put the silicone tips on these and I started going back and forth and listening to them. And I had two pretty big issues. One issue was actually a little bit subtle, but just something seemed off, and I'll get back to that in a little bit. But really, the big issue that was standing out to me was that the treble on these was just way too strong, way too pronounced. There was a lot of sibilance in the music. A lot of S sounds in people speaking was just kind of exaggerated. Crashing cymbals, or just cymbals in general, like sounded crashy. I think it just wasn't really a good sound. And frankly, I was really disappointed, and I was also kind of surprised at what they had done with the T2s. I thought the T2 Pro would be an improvement upon the original, but it seemed like they had just kind of elevated the highs, and it did have the effect of making it a less dull headphone, but it also, in my opinion, just kind of made it unlistenable. But then remembering that the foam tips, when I had them on the originals, kind of dulled the sound a little bit, I was curious how the foam tips would deal with that extra treble and that sibilance. So I plopped the foam tips back onto it, and I'm pleased to report that with the foam tips on here, the treble is still pretty elevated, and even with the foam tips, the treble here is more elevated than it is on the originals with silicone tips. But with the foam tips, the treble on these becomes, I think, mostly pleasant. It still has a little bit of sibilance to it, a little bit, but it's not as bad as something like the TRN V80s, which I reviewed before. So I think the treble on this gets a spike, which gives it a little bit more dynamics than the original. And then with the foam tips, I think that extra sibilance becomes bearable, and it becomes, frankly, a pretty pleasant listen. That said, the foam tips only solved one of my problems. I mentioned that there was something that just kind of felt off. And what I nailed it down to was that the left channel, the sound of it wasn't quite matching what I was getting out of the right channel. And so I kind of started fiddling with the cable that it came with, and came to realize that the connection that it was making was just not strong. So I swapped out the cable. This is the cable that came with my original T2s, and it totally solved that problem. And now, all of a sudden, I have this headphone that was a disappointment, that I've solved the sibilance issue for the most part. I solved the odd audio balance issue with the new cable. And now, frankly, I'm kind of in love with this headphone. So if I were to describe the sound of the T2 Pro in this configuration, it is still a fairly neutral sounding headphone, but it is a much brighter headphone than the original. It's got more of those dynamics. It feels a little bit more lively than the original T2. It doesn't have like the dullness problem. Now it does have the extra treble and the extra sibilance, which for a lot of people, frankly, I think is gonna be a problem. I know a lot of people are sensitive to treble, and for some people, even the treble on the original T2s was an issue. For me, I love the treble on the original T2s, and here's where it starts to become an issue for me. But with the foam tips, it's tamed enough that I can enjoy the extra bite that you get, the extra sizzle that you get from the elevated treble without it feeling too fatiguing. So if I were to rate the T2 Pros out of 5 stars, I'd have to give them 5 stars. And that's kind of a qualified 5-star, because if you are especially sensitive to treble, I think you're gonna be a little bit disappointed with this headphone, and I think it's gonna drive you nuts, frankly. But if you have some tolerance for treble, if you're into, a bright sounding headphone like a Grado or even like the Koss KSC75s, I think you're gonna really like the way that these sound. They have just an extra air to them that the original T2s don't. They don't make any improvements in the bass. For some people, the T2 doesn't have enough bass, and these are basically the same as the originals. For me, it's plenty of bass. Like I think it's a good punchy bass, and it's balanced with the mids, right? For me, the mids are what I'm really attracted to, and having too much bass can start to overpower the mids. Don't have that issue with the T2 Pros or the original T2s. For me, I dig it. And I'll also add, if you happen to have a pair of Comply foam tips, right? Comply is a brand that makes their own foam tips. If you happen to have a pair of those, and I do, I think they actually elevate these significantly. When I added the Comply foam tips to these, they completely solved the issues that I had with sibilance. Like literally no sibilance, but I still get that extra sparkle in the treble that I don't get with the original T2s. So for me, these with the Comply tips, I think they're like a 6-star out of 5 headphone, which I don't have 6 stars to give. They don't come with Comply tips, so it's hard to credit them too much for that. But I think this is a great headphone. If you've got Comply tips, you can make it a fantastic headphone. So if you're interested in checking out the T2 Pros, they are available on mass drop right now. So I'll have a link in the description there. If they ever show up on Amazon, I'll add a link in the description to Amazon as well. You can, of course, always get the T2s on Amazon, the original T2s, if that sounds like it's more your style. Both of them are really excellent headphones for the money. These are about $10 more than the originals. And for me, especially if you've got a pair of Comply foam tips on you, I think it's a no-brainer. Like the $10 extra is, ooh, it's quite nice. So yeah, check them out in the links below. While you're down there, you can hit the like button for this video. If you like the video, you can subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next super review.